You told me once, Grandma Kap, your mother was real clean.
Oh, my mother was clean. My grandmother was nutty clean. Oh, you hate to be around her. Huh. She'd get out on the sidewalk and scrub it. Where you walk on outside, you know. Grandma didn't have a sister. She died when she was little. She had a sister, but she passed away when she was a little girl. And she had one brother that died that was so smart, you know, was such a good person. He went to visit everybody before he died. His time was to go. He said he had to go.
I want to hear about when Grandma and Grandpa Kap joined the church. Were people mean to them about that? Do you know?
Oh, yes, spit at them and everything else when they joined the church. Ma's brother says, I'm tired of taking this. They belonged to another church, you know. Mm-hmm. And he says, I'm tired of taking this crap from them. I'm going to start with them. Let them just start. And Ma's mother said he'd sit there and argue with the minister all the time. He said, you don't have the right church. And he didn't like that, but the minister must like it because he's always waiting for him, you know. They'd go around and around and around. Ma's mother'd say, don't you dare. We're going today, and don't you dare start with him. Well, I won't, but he says, he starts with me, he's going to get it right back. So, he went that one time, and he said, you don't have the right church. He said, you think you have, but you don't. And he said, I can prove it. So when the Mormons came on a mission there, when the minute he heard him, there it is, there's the right one, he said.
And that was Grandma's brother?
Yeah.
Huh.
Oh, he knew Bible, the scriptures, the Book of Mormon, everything backwards. He was so religious. He liked to study the scriptures, you know.
Yeah.
Now, what was his name?
He was Oric.
Ulrich?
That was the oldest.
So they pretty much gave up everything they had to come here,
yeah.
Right? And then they got treated bad in addition to it.
Yeah, they came here for the church. But Ma's mother and the whole family joined the church. See, there was her father and her mother and Ma and Jake and Ulrich. See, there was that three. They all joined the church, but Dad only had one sister and a brother and him. The others wouldn't have nothing to do with it. See, Ma had her brother's kids with her in Holland for a while.
Oh, yeah?
So Ma said, you better get going, and his wife died, you know. Ma said, you better go, sell your house, and go, and I'll take care of the younger kids till you get over there.
Also,
Ma never did see him alive, though, after he left Holland.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Now, that's her brother.
Yeah, that was Ma's brother, yeah, oldest brother.
Well, Grandpa Buckway just lived 4 doors down from our home. And so as kids, we was always over at Grandpa's and Grandma's. I just remember, I don't know if you want me to tell about his wife, Rinsky.
Yeah, she's next.
I don't remember her as much because she died after Uncle Cecil was born. She was never well after Cecil was born. I think she was in her 40s when she had him. And but she had a candy dish on the cupboard. And she'd always tell us to go get a piece of candy.
Yeah.
And that's what I remember about her. That and her laying in her bed. Mom would say, don't touch your bed because if it moves, it hurts her. So she was in a lot of pain. And back then, I'm not sure if they could give him much or what, but she was in a lot of pain before she died. I was about 9 years old when she passed away.
Okay.
That's what I remember about her. But anyway, we would, after she passed away, that's when me and my sisters would go to Grandpa's on Saturday and clean his house.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So we loved to clean his house. He was always really good to us, and
this was the second house he had on Stevens, right? He had lived in one and then built one next door. Is that how it worked?
Well, when they first came to America, they lived, of course, in a tent.
Oh yeah.
In the sand.
Down in Dutch Hollow.
Dunes. Yeah, they lived in the tent, and then he earned enough money to buy 2 lots on Stevens Avenue.
Okay.
And so he built the first little home, and I'm not sure how long he lived in that one before he built the bigger home.
Okay.
And everybody used the little one.
Or different people in the family?
Well, after Mom got married, her and Daddy lived there for a while, and he used it that way. And a lot of the family, he brought some Dutch people always was living in it too, from Holland, till they got going.
Oh, really?
And so that little house was used, mainly. It belonged to him, and it was right next door to him, so.
Now, did he have a farm behind the big house out there?
He owned all behind the whole block of Stevens Avenue. He owned that whole acreage behind.
Okay.
And he would plant crops there. And the ones I remember as a kid was cucumbers.
Okay.
And we'd go out there. I learned to drive a truck at 12 years old, up and down the patch to put all the cucumbers in the back of this truck. And there were heaps of them. And then we'd go behind Grandpa's house, and we had to sort them in, because they liked little pickles or dill pickles. And so they sorted them in different sizes behind his house there, and people would come from all over to buy cucumbers.
Oh, really?
For canning and stuff like that.
Three invalid boys. They were damaged during childbirth.
Oh, okay.
And one of them died early. I can't remember. Was it Derk?
I don't remember either.
Anyway, one of them died when he was young, right after childbirth. And the other two, one of them lived to be 35 and the other one lived to be 30-something. But I can remember going over there and visiting my grandparents, and these boys, all they could do was crawl.
Really?
They couldn't walk. They could crawl, and they had those old-time wheelchairs with those big high backs on them that had that webbing in them, And we used to push them around and everything, but it was hard because there wasn't any pavement out there, because it was all dirt driveway and all that type of thing. And my grandmother she took flannel sheets and cut them up and made diapers for those boys.
Oh, wow.
And she diapered them until they died. And when they died, the last one died, it was just like she didn't know what to do with herself. It was like a big letdown, because she had all of this work that she had to do for those boys. And they had an add-on to the house, which was the kitchen. And then they walked up a little ramp into the front room, and then up some stairs to get to the bedroom. And she was coming down that ramp to go to the kitchen, and she fell and broke her hip, and that took her life.
Oh, no.
And so Grandpa was alone for years.
I know it was really hard for my grandmother after my grandfather passed away, being so young. And I know that she got a lot of sewing people in the middle of the night by just a small little light that she had, to make a living. I remember her talking about that. Oh, was she that way? You ought to have seen her clothes that she would wash and scrub. You know, she had her wash machine out on the back porch like. And no, she wouldn't. She'd hang them out like they did then, you know. And we would do the same because that's the way we grew up too. Put them out there and they'd be froze and bring them in froze. Wow. But oh, she was oh yes, her house was spotless. Staying with her one time when my folks went deer hunting, and I wanted to take a bath. Of course, she insisted that I take a bath. Let me tell you, Jed, if there was a teacup full of water in that tub, that was about all there was. Boy, but she made me take a bath, but there wasn't much water. No way. She wanted to make sure I was clean, and then I'd sleep in the spare bedroom, you know, there.
Uh-huh.
Yep, he lived over by Riverdale Road and Lincoln Avenue.
Right.
And I used to hunt rabbits, jackrabbits with him below Roy.
Oh, really?
In those days it was all sagebrush and flowing wells west of Roy. And on a Sunday, my dad and I and like some of my cousins and uncles, we'd go out and hunt jackrabbits. And Jake hunted with us, and he was still shooting black powder shells.
Really?
Yes, and he'd shoot at a jackrabbit, and you couldn't see for a minute. Black powder smoke.
He was a character, but my dad was really close to his brother Ike, and he was really close to his brother Jake. Uncle Jake I remember Uncle Jake real well. He was a storyteller. And, oh yes, Uncle Jake was quite a guy. And, you know, when you're a kid, when they can tell stories to you, in my day, that's how you communicated with your uncles.
Uh-huh.
They'd tell stories about the family.
She came to live with Grandpa when she was 4 years old.
Oh, she was that young.
Uh-huh.
Wow. So
she was 4 years old.
So she was really like a sister to your mother,
yes.
then.
Yes, they grew up like sisters. I loved, she was sweet lady.
So did you come up and see her when she lived in Morgan and as you were growing up and spend time with all those
parties
kids?
at their house.
So was Renske sick at the time? You remember her when you were young? Had she started to...
Yeah, she had a growth that stuck out on her head, and I guess she died of tumor on the brain or something. Mm-hmm. And the last I went with Mom to see her when, Stanley could take care of her and the kids, so Grandpa had her in his home in a hospital bed for a while.
Oh,
They're
really?
On Stevens Avenue. Because I remember seeing her there in a hospital bed. Then she got worse, and so they put her in this hospital in Salt Lake, some kind of care center or something. And that was one of the worst things I ever seen in my life as a person. I mean, it just haunted me. Because we went to see her, and it was like they put a sheet in a corner of a room, and here this poor lady was laying in this corner on a little bed, and it was just kind of like she was away from the world, and no one was there and to help her, and it was sad.
I had just turned 6 when Grandma Kap died, and as I think of her, I just think of a rock. She was unwavering, unchanging, strong in spirit and in body. She was pretty tall, and as a child she seemed even taller. She was a stout woman, and I remember her helping Mom. Like, she would help her with cooking a lot of the time. But I remember one of the main things she was to me and to my siblings was the nurturer, because Mom didn't have a lot of extra time to do that. And I remember at night, we didn't have a bath every day like kids do now, but we were washed completely every day. I'll have to tell you about bath time another time. But Grandma Kap would sit us on a chair, and she would sit on a chair opposite us, and she'd have a little pan of water, and she would wash everything, and she just made everything fun. We laughed a lot. It wasn't like a guttural laugh. It was a little happy chuckle, and when she would wash our feet, she would put our toes in her mouth and nibble at our toes, and she'd play Here Comes the Muska Muska, which was the mouse, and she taught us little Dutch songs. And I just remember nothing but happy about Grandma. She was in her 80s when she passed away, and I remember my brothers saying, I don't remember this event specifically, but she was in her early 80s and was still going out and having snowball fights with my brothers. So everybody in the family adored Grandma, and I don't remember her ever being down or complaining. She was just a source of strength and goodness to our family. My Mom, of course, loved her dearly, and my dad adored her. Was, as I mentioned earlier, was really a nurturer for all of the children. And when she died, there was a big hole in our house and a big void. And Diane, who was just 2 or under, she just kept walking around the house looking for Grandma. She would walk under the kitchen table or the dining table. She was so little, and she was just lost and didn't understand where Grandma was. So that's probably how we all felt. Yeah, it was a major loss, and I'm sure Mom was really impacted by her leaving.
So what'd Grandpa do over there? Grandpa Kap, what'd your dad do?
He had a ship hauling through the dikes. If my dad had stayed there, he'd have been well off. Yeah. But he came here for the church, you know.
Okay.
And that was more important to him.
So he was would he do a merchant? Like he
was a good old soul, bless his heart. He could have been well-to-do. They offered him some guy said to offer them a brand new ship if he'd stay. He said, no, I'm going. He says, I'm going for the church, and I'm not sorry I'm going. So that's how he came here.
Kind, soft-spoken, what was he like?
Yeah, very quiet, you know.
Was he?
Yeah, very quiet person.
But a hard worker.
Oh, working full. You better believe it.
Shovel coal all day.
Yeah, he worked at the sugar factory. If he'd have stayed in Holland, he'd have had a lot better, you know. But he never regretted coming.
When Grandpa came to the United States, his friend said, now, Jacob, anytime you want to come back, we'll pay for you to get back. And my grandpa says, no, he came over for the church, and he says, no, I won't be back. I'm going. And then for the rest of his life, he worked at the sugar factory in Wilson.
Right.
And stoking furnace. And at night he'd come by in his little spring wagon, because we lived in Wilson Lane, and he'd be just black. And he always had peppermints. So Bernice and I, we'd wait for Grandpa. We ate those peppermints. They were so black, but we still ate them.
When you got peppermints from Grandpa Kap, you were just a young child.
Mm-hmm.
What do you remember about his personality? Or
he was nice. Yeah, I always said he was like Santa Claus.
Your grandpa would go to great-grandpa would go to work. He'd go to work at the sugar factory, and he'd walk by our house with his lunch bucket. And I'd see him go, and I'd see him, and I was only about 4 or 5 at that time. And then he'd come back at night, and I'd see him. So a time or two when he knew I was a cat. So he would come by me, and I'd be playing in the yard. He'd come over and pat me on the head and give me a big white peppermint.
She wasn't very tall, and I think I figured out she was probably about 4'8". I don't know how tall she was when she was younger or not, but she was not tall at all. So, because I used to measure myself, as I was growing up against her to see how tall I was. And when I was 5'2", she probably came up to maybe my neck or something like chin. My grandma was a really gentle, loving person. So you could always tell that she was happy to see you when you came, and she had a big crock in her. They had a pantry that was off of there where they had their washing machine, and you passed the bathroom, and then you went in this pantry, or it was kind of like a long closet storage area, and she always had this big, like, pickle crock. She had a lid on it. She kept those wafer cookies in there.
Oh, really?
So you could go have wafer cookies, or she had another one that had the Dutch windmill cookies.
Oh, I remember those.
Yeah, so you could always get that from her. And then they always had that bitter Dutch licorice. Probably have heard that anytime they left the house, they all wore hats. They would always dress up in their best dresses to go out. And they had so Ogden had Washington Street there by their city county building. They used to have that whole block lined with park benches. And as none of them drove, they would take the bus, and they'd all meet there on Washington on the park bench, and they would wait for each other there. And when they all arrived, then they would get up and they would walk. And I think it was about a block maybe, or half a block to I want to say Vogel's, but I'm not sure that's right. Vogel's maybe, but it was a little soda shop that had sandwiches and things like that. And they would all, and the reason I know is because I got to go with my grandma a couple of times, and they would go and meet there, and they'd go have a sandwich, and then they'd all go to the Egyptian Theater and see a movie, and then afterwards they'd walk back to the bus stop, which is there on Washington with the park benches, and sometimes they'd just sit there for several hours and talk, but it was kind of like the gathering place. So all these people that their age and older and somewhat younger would come there to meet their friends, and they'd all just have a great grand time there every week. Fay, she was probably one of my favorites, and I suspect she may have been my grandma's closest sister. But they spent a lot of time together, and Aunt Fay and Uncle Dick were really, really nice, gentle people that I knew. And my mom and dad, we'd go visit them, I don't know, maybe every couple of weeks, and go out there to Wilson Lane and see them and everything. And she always had her house all decorated with all these little trinkets and fancy things, my grandma didn't do as much of that. But what I remember the most about Aunt Fay is every summer, and it may have been towards the fall, my mom and her sisters and my grandma and I think some of Aunt Fay's kids, I don't remember those so much. I was pretty young, I think. They would get together and can chicken. And so they would build a big bonfire, and they'd have this great big kettle. I have no idea what kind or where they got it from, but it was huge. I would have said it looked like a witch's cauldron. And they'd have this fire going with this great big pot on it boiling, and so Aunt Fay would catch the chicken, and she'd grab it by the head, spin it around, and then she'd put it down on this big stump, and with the other hand she had this big axe, and she just cut up its head with just in one swift motion, and then she would throw the chicken over on the ground, and it would flop around for a while squirting blood, and then they'd pick them up and take them, and they'd dip them in the pot because it would take I guess it helped loosen the feathers, and then they would so they had like an assembly line, and they would pull the feathers and off and then got them. And I remember my mom having me come over and showing me the chicken guts, and then one of them still had an egg inside of it, and she was showing me that. And then they would chop up the chickens and put them in quart jars, and I guess they pressure cook them. So, but I just remember Aunt Fay she's really industrious and really a nice person.
We had no income, and Mother had inherited nothing from my father. He didn't have anything to bequeath to the family. He had a 1929 Model A Ford car, 1929, that she inherited, and a set of harnesses for horses, but didn't have the horses. They were owned by grandfather. So in that kind of poverty, we learned to work with each other and to find our own recreation, and we did all the kinds of things that country kids would do, played all those kinds of games and so on. I was child number 4 in a family of 9 and 3 older brothers. I was enough younger than the 3 older ones that I didn't really fit with their activities. They put up with me because behind me were 2 sisters, and so they put up with me in my tagging along and the things that they would do. My grandparents on both sides of the family were immigrants from Holland. They had joined the church in Holland, and they were distant relatives. In fact, my grandfather on my mother's side was a cousin to my grandmother on my father's side.
Yeah. Mom and Dad would go out, and I think Dad did he was really a handyman.
Oh, okay.
And so he'd go out and fix things for Aunt Peka, and we went out there a lot. And I know they left me as I was probably 7 or 8 years old. I wanted to stay over. So they left me, but after they left, I got homesick. I wanted to go home, and they had to come get me. That's what I never stayed overnight, but I was out there a lot. But I was closer to Hebrew and Leroy than most, because they were more my age. Well, the girls, we were close to Bernil and Tiny. One thing I remember about Aunt Peka, her laugh.
Yeah.
She had a big boisterous laugh. She could, and then she was always a happy person with all those kids, and everything. She was a happy person, and I remember going out there, and she was making homemade soap. She had a big can. It was outside. She had a bonfire, and a big pan on this, and she was making this homemade soap.
My grandfather was Jacob Buckway. His nieces and nephews always called him Old Uncle because he lived to be to such an old age. Grandpa was 82 years old when I was born, and he just died shy of his 92nd birthday. Grandpa lived with us. I remember that he had beautiful blue eyes, he had a mustache, and he had thick white hair. Grandpa always wore overalls, and in the top pockets of his overalls, he kept his pipe, tobacco, and a match. And I can still remember him lighting up his pipe, and it had such a delicious aroma to that pipe tobacco. Grandpa always kept peppermints or lemon drop candy inside his pocket, and he would always share it with his kids. When Grandpa was about 90 years old, my brother Richard Clare Weeding, was 3 years old, and he would always take Clara for a walk down the block and back. This is a cane that belonged to my grandfather, and Claire brought that over to me about a year ago, and it brought back some memories. I remember that Claire would be in his little overalls, and Grandpa would be in his overalls, and Grandpa would have his cane, and Claire would have this cane that Grandpa had cut down for him so it would be the right length for Claire, and they would go walking down to the end of the block and back. I remember that they looked so cute, and I always thought how funny it was that they looked so much alike walking down the street. And anyway, I'm really grateful that Jacob was my grandfather, and I loved him very much. This is a picture of my grandfather, and this is a picture of my grandfather with my brother Claire and my sister Dora. I'm going to share with you a few memories of my Uncle George Jacob Buckway. Whenever I think about Uncle George, my heart just kind of smiled. He was such a boisterous man. He was so funny, and he loved to joke and kid with everybody. His wife, Aunt Annie, was just the opposite of him, and yet they were so perfect together. I still remember him and Aunt Annie looking at each other, and you could see just the love and their commitment to each other. I just loved to see them together. Uncle George always came to Ogden about 4 or 5 times a year from his home in Salt Lake City. And he always came in the springtime, and it was hot weather there in the season. And he would always give us kids each a quarter, and we'd run down to the corner store, and we would each buy a kite and string. And we'd run back home, and Mom would give us an old sheet that we could tear up and make a kite tail for. Then we'd all run over to the field, and we would fly our kites. So every spring, I always think about Uncle George and kites. This is a picture of Uncle George and his wife Annie. This is a picture of my Aunt Fay Buckway. Aunt Fay was really quite a character. She lived her life exactly how she wanted to live it, and she made no excuses for it. A couple years ago, when my daughter and I was looking through some old newspapers on the internet, we ran across several stories about Aunt Fay. But one of the stories that we thought was really funny, it said girls escaped from reform school. And then the next article was girls were captured and sent back to reform school. You read the article, and one of those girls was my Aunt Fay. My daughter Elaine thinks that she just loves her because she's such a colorful person in our family. Aunt Fay was also a very generous person. when my brother Russell used to hitchhike to San Francisco, he'd always stop by Aunt Fay's house, and she would feed him, give him a place to sleep for a night or two, and then send him off when he was ready with some cash. Another thing she did was that she had a house in California that she rented out, and the people, they were just a young family, and they were having a difficult time, and so Aunt Fay let them pay such a small amount of rent for the house. And we never heard about this from Aunt Fay. It was the other people that she always did things for that we found out what she had done for them. Aunt Fay loved her family very much. She was crazy about all of her brothers, all of her sisters, her nieces, and her nephews. And I am so glad that Aunt Fay was my aunt, because she really lived her life how she wanted to do it. I remember one of the things she did, I have to say, is that Dora, my mother, Aunt Fay and I would go on vacation together once in a while. And Aunt Fay used to like to tell us little risque stories because she thought it would shock us. And sometimes it did. But anyway, I'm really grateful for Aunt Fay. Brother, Derk Buckway. We called him Uncle Dick. He was my favorite uncle. He was a wanderer. He would stay in Ogden for a while, and then he would move to Reno, Nevada, where his two sisters, Fay and Ella, lived. Pretty soon after a while, he decided he'd want to go to California, and he'd stay with his sister Jane in California. A few years later, he'd be back to Ogden. Uncle Dick was a very nice man, and he was very generous with his nieces and his nephews. I remember my cousin Sharon telling me about her and her sister Sandy and our cousin Gayleen would be walking down by the Marion Hotel where Uncle Dick lived, and that they would go inside and visit with him, and he always gave them some money. Now with us, we always would walk down past the Marion Hotel on Parade Day, the 24th of July parade, and go and see Uncle Dick, and he always gave us money too. When Uncle Dick got older, he moved in with my mom, and he helped take care of the house and the yard. He always kept busy. When my mom got sick, when she was diagnosed with cancer, Uncle Dick stayed with her, and I will always be so grateful to him because he took such good care of her. He was so gentle with him. So Uncle Dick has my eternal gratitude for all that he did for my mom. This is a picture of Uncle Dick on my oldest son, Shane. This is a picture of my mom's brother, Oric Buckway. Out of all of my mom's brothers, Uncle Oric was the quietest one. He and my Aunt May, they lived on Stephens Avenue, right across the street from their cousin, George Buckway. George was the son of my grandmother's brother, Oric Buckway. Aunt May and Uncle Oric always made you feel really welcome when you went into their home. One of the things they had, they would always take you into their kitchen, and they had this drawer where they would open it up, and it was always filled with cookies and candy, and you got to pick whatever you wanted to out of that drawer. Uncle Oric used to come over to our house, and he would always give us a quarter when he came over, and we were really thrilled, and we used to run to the store and buy us candy with that. I asked my sister, my older sister Brenda, when she thought about Uncle Oric, what's the first thing that came to her mind? And she told me how kind he was. And then my sister Dora and I were out to breakfast 2 weeks ago, and I asked her the same question. What's the first thing you think of when you think about Uncle Oric? And she gave me the same reply, was how kind he was. And I thought, that's the first thing I've always thought of too. When I think about my Uncle Oric, I always think about how kind he was. So I'm really grateful to have Uncle Oric for my uncle, because he really was such a kind and generous man. Thank you. Today I'm going to share with you some memories of my Uncle Heinz. His name was Hendrik Buckway. Uncle Heinz died a couple years before I was born, and so the memories that I'm sharing with you today is that of his daughter Sharon. Sharon was one of my closest friends, and just not a cousin, but she was a really good friend to me. Sharon was an extremely nice person and a very spiritual woman. She would tell me that she looked forward to the time when she would be able to see her dad again. Sharon died in 2014, or she would be doing this video for you. But one of the memories that she shared with me was that her father had a really good singing voice, and that Uncle Heinz and his wife Verba would call their 5 children together, and they would sing songs to them. After a few songs, and the children would join in. I remember Sharon telling me that their favorite song was You're My Sunshine. Another memory that Sharon shared to me was that her dad had a horse, and oh, how he loved his horse. His horse's name was Ned. Sharon remembered that he rode it in the Pioneer Day Parade and also at the rodeo. Sharon's sister Sandy shared this story about her dad and his horse that she was told by her mother. And as one day Uncle Heinz decided that he was going to stop and have a beer as he was on his horse. So he stopped outside the tavern and he tied he tied his horse to a parking meter, and then he went inside the tavern and he ordered a beer. He happened to glance out the window and noticed that there was a police officer standing next to his horse. And so Uncle Heinz rushed out there and told the police officer, "Don't touch my horse, but you can do anything you want to me." So that was just some of the memories that I'm able to share with you that Sharon shared with me. This is a picture of my mother, Grace Buckway Weeding. My mom was one of the kindest, generous, and non-judgmental people I've ever met. Even now that my mom has been gone for 40 years, when I run into one of my friends from high school, they always talk about my mom and tell me their memories of her. They tell me how lucky I was to have such a good mother. Mom used to be so much fun, and my friends always tried to get her to go dragging the boulevard with us. We used to go from Combie's on 12th and Washington down to Mason's on Riverdale Road, and my mom actually joined us a couple of times. My mom and Dad always kept a roof over our head, and we had plenty of food to eat. My mom used to can vegetables and fruit. She made jams and jellies and sauces, pickles and relishes. We always had a big gunny sacks of potatoes and onions in the dirt cellar. What we didn't have a lot of was dessert. My mom didn't cook dessert. She made a hot meal every single night, but she seldom made dessert. Once in a while a cake, a pie, or pudding from scratch. I remember one summer, Dora and I were outside playing, and my mom called us in. And she had root beer, and wow, root beer, that was even rarer than dessert. And so mom took 2 glasses and she poured them out on the cupboard, one for Dora and one for me. And Dora and I started arguing about which glass was the fullest. And my mom looked at us, she picked up the 2 glasses and she poured them down the drain. She never had us say a word. We knew immediately what she was telling us, and believe me, we never made that same mistake again. I feel very honored and very privileged that I had Grace Buckway for my mother. She was the most wonderful person in the entire world. Thank you.